get started with the class, well, the mini class. I think you're here for the social movements course, right? Yeah, okay. This is a good time to be studying social movements, I think. Yeah, why?
There's so much going on.
Exactly, what's going on? Charlottesville, what else? I mean, what does that mean? What is that about? What are those movements in Charlottesville about?
We're sort of living in a very inflammatory society, you know, like people are very on edge, and I feel like things are pouring over in certain areas.
A lot of things are on edge, and yeah, but what about, right?
Pushing personal boundaries and what's like the norm for people.
So now we're breaking norms, right, in some ways, but what are some of those norms too? And that's part of the debate. If we think about the more current one, in the example of Charlottesville, I mean, we just actually had on Monday a similar protest here in Bradenton, right? And this is about what I would say, what people are calling the fight of people who identify as anti-fascists, right? Or people who are anti-racists or anti-racism, right? And then on the other side, people who are saying we want to defend the respect and recognition of history, right? And the role of people who are fighting, in this case, for the South. So we have, on the one hand, that racial tension going on that is very current. Right before that, from a different kind of angle, we have Black Lives Matter movement, right? And that's just in the last few weeks, that's kind of gone a little bit in the background when it's a different issue in its specificity, but in the end, both are movements that are talking about issues of racial inequality in the US, and how are we going to be addressing them and pushing the boundaries that have been created and saying we need to, it's not enough what we've achieved. We want to engage into much greater equality and respect in our society from racial, ethnic perspectives. Immigrants and immigrant movements is part of that as well. Dreamers continue to push. We have had, again, more locally, a lot of students involved with the Coalition of Immaculate Workers. So the labor rights issue in relation as well with the race ethnicity framework. A little bit farther behind, but still a theme, the issue of gay rights. That a little bit behind, not that long ago, that they gained the right to same-sex marriage, right? So in that framework, now there continues to be now pushback. We think of the current debate of transgendered people in the military, right? So there's the pushback and people then pushing again. So we have a variety of themes going on, and then we have Bernie pushing for the economic side of things, right? And in many ways, that is the theme for President Trump, saying we need to have and protect the workers' rights and workers' interests, that a lot of people read as where a lot of the support came from him. So the class issue is at play as well, and the question being the various kinds of movements all around pushing for this wide variety of interests. It sounds like the 1960s to me, in the expression of the 21st century, right, with a different sort of framework, but a lot of these various kinds of mobilizations. So it becomes really a very interesting moment for us to explore why are these movements happening? Is it as simple as the fact that people are just unhappy and this is the only way to improve the quality of life in their lives? We've seen a lot of unhappy people, on the other hand, around the world, but they're not all mobilizing. So why is that mobilization happening now and in the way that it is happening? We observe poverty in many places, but people do not always take action either, right? So is that because they're afraid of repression? And yet we see repression happening. And then why do those people keep on mobilizing despite the repression? In fact, we know many times repression will lead to more mobilization. It's counterproductive. So what else is behind all of these different phenomena, right? So from the individual level, what gets one person to actually participate in a social movement, to broader frameworks of why are these kinds of movements taking place, and what is the interaction between the movements? Is there something brewing where we're seeing all of these different types of movements on gender, sexuality rights, on race and ethnicity, on class and happening? Is there, and not only within the context of the US, we're seeing globally a significant push for greater participation and more democracy, discontent with what people would conceive as the corruption in the political environment, right? We can think of Venezuela, we can think of Brazil, we can, you name it. So all of these things are interacting. So one of the things that we'll be exploring as well, how do these things feed and influence each other for us to understand why this is happening? And so these are some of the questions that we'll be exploring. Now, to explore social movements in this course, we're going to do it from a sociological, academic perspective, which is different from learning how to carry out a social movement. So this is not going to be a workshop on how to do a movement. This is an academic exploration, a sociological analysis of social change, more specifically through the lens of mobilization, social movements. Of course, this does not mean that there's no practical lessons to be learned from it, right? So we can gather a lot of information for that, for our own activist action beyond that, and bring that there. And that speaks into a different issue that perhaps we can get into through the course, which is what is the relationship between the academic world and the practical world, right? And how can we bring those together? In a way, that's the attempt of the students' API. Is that API? Yeah. Remind me, what's the? Thank you. All Power to the Imagination conference attempts to bring those two elements together, right? So there will be a lot to be learned here academically that you could then take beyond if you are engaged in more activist action. The course is structured around sociological theory, moving from earlier explanations of collective action through challenges to these earlier interpretations, and then moving on to more recent outlooks on social movements. We will work with one main text to guide the logic of the theoretical development. However, we will also read 3 other books that illustrate some of these theoretical analyses. And of course, book chapters and journal articles will also serve to add to that. We begin theory with theories surrounding formation of grievances and what is known as breakdown theory, right? The idea that we have mobilizations because there's a breakdown in the social organization, a breakdown in the norms, and that leads people to want to recreate order, and therefore they mobilize, right? We will use the classic analysis of revolutions by Eric Wolf to explore revolutionary action as a very distinct kind of mobilization, different from revolutions as a distinct phenomena from social movements. And it will give us a bit of a historical sense of revolutions like the Russian, the Mexican, Algerian, and Cuban revolution, right? So we get a feel for that historical process with an analysis of heavily influenced by breakdown theory, but he also takes a different perspective to it, including the idea of what is called political opportunity structure, right? How does the political process allows, facilitates, or prevents mobilization? Once we're done with the revolutionary analysis, we look into what is called resource mobilization theory. We see some elements of that actually in Wolf's work, and then we get more in depth into resource mobilization as a theory with the particular example of the civil rights movement in the US, right? And the origins of the civil rights movement by Aldon Morris is what we'll be using as the text to explore that framework. Then we look at networks, to what extent are to what extent are the social relations between individuals shaping the possibility for a movement to take place, or between the individuals that help organizations come together, create different kinds of networks for mobilization to take shape and the kind of shape it takes. This would be considered to some degree a microstructural factor that influences mobilization. By the early 1990s, scholars begin to pay more attention to how social movements present themselves and are perceived by the larger society and others. This is simplified in the characterization of what is called frame analysis. So we'll be exploring this idea of how are we framing the perspectives of and the representations. Coming back to the original example, what is the symbolism of a particular statue, right, in the context of the courthouse, for instance, right? Whose interpretation becomes the more predominant one, and why does one interpretation kind of take more hold in the larger society than another? So the way in which movements are able to present a particular kind of argument, they're able to get more or less support for what their attempt is. We then move to explore various themes in social movements theory, such as the social psychology of participation, the role of strategies and tactics, as well as what is called extra and intra-movement dynamics, right? The movement's relationship outside and within the movements. If we think about, for instance, one of the tensions within the women's movement in the 1960s was the racism within. One of the tensions within the civil rights movement was the sexism within, right? And those tensions then shape the movement structures within the particular goal of that movement. So those are intra and extra movement dynamics. We will dedicate 3 class periods specifically to Latin American social movements. That's just because that's my expertise. Illustrating some of the current outlooks in the study of social movements, while these also expand our horizons for understanding social movement theory beyond what we've read in the US in an European outlook. These are very particular experiences, so the outlooks that we're seeing from there are actually refreshing in a way, bringing a different framework. And we will end the course with an exploration of the significance of social movements, right? Do they matter? And how do they matter? Expectations, of course, come into class having done the reading, participation as well. And in order to participate, you need to have done the readings. If people don't do the readings, the process won't work as well. I will be doing a bit of lecturing at the beginning of the course, but fairly soon we'll be moving more into class discussion format. We will have 2 exams, one in class, one take-home exam, and you will be expected to do a research paper on a social movement of your choice. Now, I'm giving people 3 choices of the approach to that, I would say not paper, but maybe project. Right? You could do a traditional bibliographic research. There's some social movement you want to explore, you don't know much about it, you want to learn more, and you do the traditional aspect of going to the library, getting the bibliography, and writing up a paper. The second choice would be a Wikipedia project. So you could explore a social movement that interests you, but for which there is no Wikipedia page, or there's just what is called a stub. It's just a little tiny thing, and yet there's enough research out there from academic sources and other reliable sources that you can use to build up that Wikipedia page, right? And the third choice would be an empirical research, right? There might be, if you want to explore the local, I don't know, progressive Sarasota movement, to throw a name out there that people haven't explored, then you could actually then go do observations, interviews, and so on. People who want to do that, however, need to have had what is called the CITI training, is the human subjects research training prior to engaging in that research. And eventually in the first class, I will provide more details for each of these things. So any questions about it?
Are you capping the class, and what is preference given to which students?
Thank you, yes. This course is an intermediate level course, so preference will be given to second year students and above, right? And I teach it just about every other year, because sometimes I teach these, or otherwise I teach the globalization, human rights, social justice course. So, they're like 1 year and then the other year, right? So this year I'm doing this course. So because of that, I probably would give more priority to seniors because they won't have another opportunity later on. Will I cap it? I usually haven't had to. So we'll see.